The restaurant was filled with warm light, polished silverware, and the quiet hum of expensive conversations to the wealthy guests. The place was a second home, a stage where they displayed success, power, and taste. But to the young server moving silently between the tables, it was simply his workplace, a place where he disappeared into the background. Every evening, he carried trays heavier than they looked, balancing plates of fine food that he could never afford himself. He bowed politely, spoke only when spoken to, and always wore the same professional smile that was expected of him. To most of the guests, he was invisible, another part of the service, no different from the linen on the tables or the polished glass on the shelves. But beneath that quiet mask lived a different story. When his shift ended and he returned to his small apartment on the edge of the city, he was no longer just a server in that cramped space. With peeling paint on the walls and a window that barely opened, there sat an old keyboard, scratched and slightly out of tune. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was here that he found his escape, pressing keys late into the night, playing melodies he had taught himself by ear. No one had ever given him lessons, and he had never stepped foot into a music academy. Yet music was his world, a world he entered every time his fingers touched those keys. Sometimes, after long shifts, when his body ached and his feet burned, he would still sit down at that keyboard. The music carried him away from the heaviness of reality, into a place where he was free, free from the noise of clinking glasses, free from the orders shouted from the kitchen, free from the looks of guests who never really saw him. In those late hours, he was not invisible, not forgotten. He was a creator, a dreamer, someone who poured his feelings into every note. And though no one else was there to listen, he believed that the music mattered. It mattered because it was his voice, the only one he truly trusted. Day after day, his life continued in this rhythm. At the restaurant, he blended into the shadows. At home, he came alive. This double life was his secret, one he never shared with coworkers or friends. They only knew the quiet server who did his job without complaint. They never knew the musician who sat awake at midnight, creating songs that carried both sadness and hope. The contrast was sharp, but he had learned to accept it. He knew that people like him rarely got the chance to show what they were capable of. He had seen how the world worked, how talent often went unnoticed unless it came packaged with money, connections, or opportunity. And he had none of those. Still, he couldn't let go. Music was not just a hobby. It was his heartbeat. He often told himself that as long as he could play, life still had meaning, even if no one else ever heard him. He would keep playing, yet, somewhere inside, there was a quiet longing, a small, stubborn hope that maybe one day someone would hear, someone would stop and listen, and in that moment they would understand. But for now, the dream stayed locked away. Hidden behind the polished black vest and white shirt of his uniform, he knew his role: to walk silently, to smile politely, and to serve the world without being seen. The nights at the restaurant stretched endlessly. The rich laughed, raised glasses, and made speeches that echoed across the hall. He moved among them unnoticed, his own life a whisper compared to their loud stories of success. And yet, as he watched them, he often wondered if they had ever truly felt what he felt when playing. Did they know the joy of creating something from nothing, the way a simple melody could hold the weight of 1,000 emotions? Or were they too busy living in the noise of their wealth to hear the quiet truths of life? Every time he returned to his small apartment after midnight, he carried those questions with him, and every time his fingers answered on the keys of his old piano. The music never judged him, never looked down on him, never treated him as invisible. In that way, the piano was his only true companion. And in the silence of those nights, with no audience, no applause, and no spotlight, he found his identity. He was not just a server, not just a shadow in a wealthy world. He was an artist waiting in the dark, even if the world had not yet noticed. A hidden passion most people at the restaurant never asked about the server's life outside of work. To them, he was only part of the staff, someone whose story began and ended with clearing tables and carrying plates. But behind the tired smile and quiet steps, he carried a passion that no one could see. That passion lived in the keys of an old second-hand piano. A piece of furniture he had rescued from a junk shop years ago. It was scratched, uneven in sound, and missing a few keys, but to him, it was priceless. Every night, after finishing long hours at the restaurant, he walked home through quiet streets. The city seemed to glow with lights. But none of those lights belonged to him. He lived in a small one-room apartment, hardly bigger than the restaurant's storage area. Yet inside that little space, the piano stood like a secret treasure. The moment he sat down, the weight of the day lifted. His fingers would move slowly at first, pressing the keys with care, as though waking an old friend from sleep, and then the music would flow. It wasn't music that followed strict notes from a book. He didn't have books, and he had never learned to read sheet music. Instead, he played by feeling, letting his hands search for the right sounds. Sometimes the melodies were soft, carrying the ache of exhaustion and loneliness. Other times, they burst with energy, full of dreams and desires too big for his small apartment. The piano became a mirror of his heart. It spoke what he could never say in words. It told stories of hope, sadness, love, and longing. And though no one else was there to listen, he always felt less alone after playing. The neighbors sometimes heard faint music through the thin walls. One woman down the hall once asked if he had a radio playing at night. He only smiled and nodded, never admitting that it was him at the piano. He wanted to keep that part of himself private, hidden from a world that might laugh at the idea of a server dreaming of music. This hidden passion was his safe place, a place where failure, rejection, and judgment could not touch him. His routine was always the same: work, serve, return home, play. But within that routine, something powerful was growing. He was getting better without realizing it. His fingers grew stronger, quicker, more confident. He could play for hours without tiring. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, it felt like the music was flowing through him instead of from him. He wasn't just playing anymore. He was becoming the music itself, despite the joy it gave him. There was also a shadow of sadness. He often wondered what his life might have been like if he had been born into a different family. One with enough money to buy a proper piano, to afford music lessons, to encourage him to chase his talent. Instead, he had been born into a life of struggle, where every dollar counted and dreams were considered luxuries. So he kept his dream locked away, playing in secret, while the world knew him only as a silent worker in a crowded restaurant. But passion has a way of revealing itself, even when we try to hide it. Sometimes, while clearing tables, he would hum a tune softly to himself, a melody that no one else recognized because it was his own. A coworker once overheard and asked where the tune came from. He quickly shook his head, saying it was nothing, just something stuck in his head. The coworker laughed and didn't ask again, but inside, the young server knew the truth. The tune was part of him, a piece of his hidden world slipping into the open. The nights with the piano became his fuel. Without them, the weight of his job would have crushed him every time he thought about quitting. Giving up on the long hours and invisible life, he would sit at the keys and remember why he kept going. Music gave him hope. Hope that someday, in some way, the world might hear what he had to say. Hope that he wouldn't always live in the shadows. Hope that he was more than the role life had assigned him. The piano didn't just give him music. It gave him identity. In a world where he felt like no one knew his name, the piano reminded him who he was. It reminded him that even in his small apartment, even without an audience, his voice mattered. And even though he didn't realize it yet, this hidden passion would not stay hidden forever. It was only a matter of time before the world saw the side of him he had carefully kept secret. The glittering crowd the night of the gala was unlike any other. The restaurant had been transformed into something closer to a palace. Crystal chandeliers glowed like stars above the guests, their light spilling across tables covered in white. Linen and golden cutlery, every detail was perfect. From the roses in the vases to the candles that flickered gently. Sending shadows dancing across the walls, the wealthy guests arrived in black cars and designer gowns, stepping out as though walking into a stage play where they were the stars. The young server moved among them quietly, his uniform freshly pressed, his shoes polished. His hands steady as he carried trays of champagne to the guests. He was only part of the service, another shadow gliding past their laughter and conversations. But from his view, the scene was fascinating, almost unreal. He watched men in sharp suits lean back in leather chairs, boasting about business deals that had made them fortunes. He saw women dressed in glittering gowns, their voices floating like music as they compared jewelry and travel destinations. The entire room shimmered with wealth. A world that seemed so far from his own. He noticed how easily the rich moved through the room, as if they belonged to the air itself. Every laugh, every gesture, every word carried confidence. They didn't worry about bills or late rent. They didn't come home to peeling paint or broken locks. They lived in a different rhythm, one that sang of luxury and power. And yet, as he poured wine and served dishes, he couldn't help but wonder if something was missing in all their glitter. At one table near the stage, a group of businessmen laughed loudly. One slapped the table after telling a joke, nearly knocking over his glass of wine. At another, a woman scrolled through her phone under the table, barely listening to the person speaking beside her. Everywhere he turned, the server saw polished faces, but he couldn't see what lay beneath them. Were they truly as happy as they looked? Or was it just another performance? The room sparkled. But he knew better than most that appearances were only part of the story. He carried a tray past the stage and noticed something unusual. The grand piano that usually sat in the corner was now placed right at the center. Its polished black surface gleamed under the soft lights, waiting for the evening's hired musician. Music was meant to be the backdrop of this glamorous night, a quiet reminder of sophistication. The server's eyes lingered on the piano longer than they should have. For him, it wasn't just an instrument. It was a voice, a dream, a lifeline. He quickly looked away, afraid that someone might catch the longing in his eyes. The crowd continued to grow louder as the evening went on. The sound of forks on porcelain mixed with bursts of laughter and clinking glasses. Waiters weaved between tables with trays stacked high. And the young server kept pace with the rhythm of service, but in the back of his mind, the piano kept calling. He imagined what it would feel like to sit at it, to let his fingers bring silence to this noisy room. The thought was impossible, almost foolish. Yet it stayed with him. It stayed because he knew that music had the power to cut through the noise, to remind people of what truly mattered. From the sidelines, he watched the crowd closely. He saw how easily they dismissed the staff, barely glancing at the servers unless they needed something. It was a world built on status, where one group existed to be seen and the other to remain invisible. But he wasn't bitter, not completely. He understood the rules of the room, understood his place at the same time. He carried a secret the crowd would never suspect. None of them could imagine that the quiet man carrying plates had a talent locked inside him that could silence their voices. The evening reached its peak when the host stepped onto the stage. He welcomed the crowd, thanked the donors, and spoke about the importance of giving back. The audience clapped politely, though many continued sipping drinks and whispering among themselves. The piano stood ready at the center, but the scheduled performer had not yet arrived. A ripple of impatience passed through the tables. The guests wanted their entertainment, and the organizers looked nervous. The server, standing in the shadows, felt his heart beat faster. It was as though the universe had shifted slightly. opening a door he had never expected. He knew he could play. He knew he could transform the room. But he also knew his role. Servers didn't sit at pianos. They didn't take the stage. They didn't interrupt the world of the wealthy. And yet, the piano gleamed under the light. Like it was waiting for him, as if it knew his secret and was daring him to reveal it. The glittering crowd carried on with their conversations, unaware of the storm quietly rising in the heart of the man serving their drinks. To them, it was just another evening of wealth and laughter. But for him, it was the beginning of something he had only dreamed about. He couldn't know it yet, but soon this same crowd would fall into silence. Not from speeches, not from wealth, but from the raw truth of music played by a man they had never truly seen. An unexpected opportunity, the evening pressed forward with elegance. Yet something was wrong. The grand piano sat gleaming at the center of the stage, but its bench remained empty. Whispers passed quietly among the organizers, their polite smiles stretched thin as they tried to mask their worry. The scheduled pianist, a well-known performer hired to impress the crowd, was nowhere to be found. Every minute that passed without music made the tension in the room thicker. The guests noticed too. Some leaned back in their chairs, sipping wine with raised brows. Others whispered complaints, their impatience hidden behind laughter. For them, music was not just background entertainment. It was part of the performance of the night. They had come to see wealth, elegance, and art all wrapped into one experience. And now, one of those pieces was missing. In the corner of the room, the young server carried a tray of empty glasses. He felt the unease ripple through the hall. But to him, it wasn't just about a missing musician. It was about the piano itself. His eyes kept drifting toward it, unable to resist the pull. It shone under the soft golden lights, every curve polished, every key waiting. He could almost hear the sound it would make if his fingers touched it. His heart quickened at the thought. Even though he knew it was impossible, the event manager, a woman in a crisp suit with a headset pressed to her ear, paced near the stage. She whispered urgently into her microphone, asking about the pianist's whereabouts. No clear answer came. Finally, in frustration, she turned to the staff standing nearby. "Does anyone here know how to play at least something?" she asked under her breath, half desperate, half joking. The server froze. The words struck him like lightning, his body stiff, his pulse racing. He wanted to step forward, to say, "Yes, I can play." But fear held him in place, his mind filled with doubt. He was a server, not an entertainer. This was a world of wealth, and he was not meant to cross into it. The very thought of sitting at that piano in front of the glittering crowd made his chest tighten. But the silence stretched too long. The guests grew restless, their voices louder, their impatience clear. The manager muttered something about switching to recorded music. But even she knew it wouldn't match the moment. Something inside the young server stirred. A quiet voice he'd ignored for years. "This is your chance," it whispered. "Take it before it disappears." He stepped closer to the stage, his hands trembling slightly as he balanced his tray. The manager noticed and raised an eyebrow. "You?" she asked, her tone skeptical. He nodded slowly, unsure if he had made a mistake. Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for signs of confidence. "You're sure you can play?" she asked again. His throat felt dry, but he managed to answer with a steady voice. "Yes," he said softly. "I can play." For a long moment, she hesitated, torn between doubt and desperation. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. Sit down, just. Don't embarrass us," she whispered. Stepping aside, it wasn't exactly encouragement, but it was enough. The server placed his tray down carefully, his legs moving almost on their own toward the piano. The chatter in the room shifted. People noticed, eyes followed him as he walked, confusion spreading across the tables. A server, dressed in uniform, walking toward the piano. Whispers rose like wind through the crowd, some curious, some mocking. But he didn't stop. For once, he didn't let their voices define him. He reached the bench and sat down slowly. His hands hovered above the keys, his breath uneven. The weight of hundreds of eyes pressed against him. For a brief second, fear nearly won. He imagined hitting the wrong note, imagined the laughter, imagined being thrown out and humiliated. But then, he remembered the countless nights in his small apartment, the hours of practice, the melodies that carried him through loneliness. The piano had never betrayed him before. And it wouldn't now. The room hushed, forks stilled. Glasses lowered, conversations paused. The glittering crowd leaned back, waiting to see what this quiet man could possibly offer. He closed his eyes, drew a deep breath, and let his fingers fall. The first notes were soft, gentle, like a whisper. In a storm, they floated through the hall, delicate yet certain. A wave of silence followed. Spreading from table to table, the same guests who had ignored him minutes ago now watched him closely. Something in the music caught them. Something honest, something raw. It was not the polished perfection they expected from a professional. It was something else, something real. The server felt it too. His fear melted with every chord, replaced by something stronger. The music took hold of him. Guiding his fingers as if they were no longer his own, he poured into the keys every hidden dream, every quiet night, every moment of being unseen. The piano answered with a voice larger than himself, a voice that filled the entire hall for the first time in his life. He was not invisible. The glittering crowd sat in silence, and every note told them the story of a man they had never noticed. He wasn't serving them now. He was showing them who he truly was. And in that moment, the shadows he had lived in for so long began to fall away. First notes in silence, the first touch of his fingers on the keys was almost hesitant, like a secret. Slipping into the open, a soft melody rose into the air, fragile but alive. Drifting across the glittering hall for a moment, some guests smirked, expecting a clumsy attempt, but as the notes settled, their smiles faded, replaced by something they had not expected at all. The piano spoke with honesty, each sound carrying more weight than words could. It was not the polished style of a trained performer, but something raw and real. The melody was delicate yet steady, as if pulled from the deepest parts of his soul. And slowly, the noise of the evening began to fade. Forks stopped clinking against plates, wine glasses were set down carefully. Conversations cut short mid-sentence. All eyes turned toward the man who, only minutes earlier, had been invisible among them. The server sat hunched slightly over the piano, his uniform crisp but ordinary. He looked nothing like the artists the guests were used to, and yet the music pouring from his hands was richer than any introduction could have been. Every key he pressed told a story of late nights in a cramped apartment, of exhaustion carried with silent dignity, of dreams too large for the life he lived. The crowd leaned in without realizing it, caught in the spell of his truth. A woman in the front row tilted her head, her jeweled earrings catching the light as her expression softened. She had arrived expecting entertainment, something pleasant, to match her glass of champagne. Instead, she found herself blinking back tears at the unexpected honesty in the music. At another table, a man who had been loudly bragging about his company's success now sat quietly. He held his chin in his hand, staring at the server with a look that mixed disbelief and admiration. The server himself felt the shift. He had begun with trembling fingers, afraid of failure. But the moment the silence fell, something changed inside him. The music was no longer about proving himself, no longer about fear of judgment. It was about release, about finally letting the world hear the voice he had hidden for so long. His hands moved more freely now, flowing from one chord to another, weaving a story that belonged only to him. The hall seemed to vanish. The glittering crowd disappeared. And there was only the piano and the truth it carried. Every note stretched time. The candles flickered slower. The golden light seemed warmer. The air itself felt charged. The guests did not breathe too loudly, afraid they might break the spell. For the first time in a long while, silence was not empty. It was full of meaning, full of feeling, full of something money could not buy. The server closed his eyes briefly. Letting memory guide his hands, he remembered the nights when he had played with no one listening. The moments when exhaustion pushed him to the keys and music gave him the strength to keep going. He remembered his doubts, his struggles, the weight of being unseen, and he poured it all into the piano, each note becoming a confession. The crowd, without knowing his story, felt it anyway. Because truth in music does not need words. It simply finds its way into the heart. A hush hung over the room so deep that even the clinking of ice in a forgotten glass sounded loud. One child, sitting beside her parents, leaned forward with wide eyes, as if witnessing magic. Her parents, too, were caught in the moment, their earlier conversations forgotten. This was no longer background entertainment. This was something living, breathing, undeniable. The manager who had reluctantly given him permission now stood frozen near the stage. She had expected, at best, a few recognizable tunes to fill the gap. What she witnessed instead was a transformation. The same man she had barely noticed on her staff list was commanding the entire room with nothing but his hands. She didn't dare move, didn't dare interrupt, because she knew, like everyone else, that this was not a moment to be broken. The music built slowly, growing deeper, fuller, carrying layers of emotion. At times, it whispered like a secret. Between friends, at times it rose like a storm breaking free. The audience swayed with it unknowingly, their bodies responding before their minds caught up. The hall, once filled with noise and chatter, now held something rare: unity. Every guest, no matter their wealth or status, was connected by the same invisible thread, tied together by the sound of truth. And yet, even in that moment of power, the server did not think of himself as greater than them. He thought only of the music, of how it had always been his only companion. He thought of how it had carried him through the shadows of life. And now, for the first time, he was sharing it openly. The fear that once silenced him had turned into strength. The silence of the crowd was no longer intimidating. It was sacred as the last notes of the opening piece faded. The hall remained still. No one rushed to clap. No one dared to speak. The quiet stretched out, heavy and beautiful. The server lifted his hands gently from the keys, his chest rising with deep breaths. For a moment, he feared he had failed, that the silence meant rejection. But then he looked up, and what he saw told him everything. The glittering crowd was not disappointed, not bored, not mocking. They were silent because they were moved. Silent because they had been reminded of something they had long forgotten: the power of honesty, the beauty of simplicity, the truth of a human soul expressed without words. And in that silence, the young server realized something he had never dared to believe: he belonged here, not as a shadow, not as invisible staff, but as himself. The silence was not empty. It was a sound of recognition. It was the sound of people finally seeing him. The music takes over the silence in the hall. Was heavy. But it wasn't empty. It was the silence of breath held, of hearts waiting, of a room drawn completely into his world. And then, without pause, his fingers moved again, this time with more certainty, more fire. The music returned, not as a whisper, but as a voice that had been waiting too long to be heard. The server no longer thought about the crowd watching him, who no longer thought about his uniform, his tray, or the long hours spent carrying plates. All of that slipped away as the piano claimed him. He belonged entirely to the music now. His body leaned with each phrase. His hands glided and struck with confidence. The piano was no longer an instrument. It was an extension of himself, the melodies swelled and tumbled, rising and falling like waves, at one moment tender, pulling at the heart with quiet emotion, at the next, thunderous, filling the hall with sounds so powerful it seemed impossible. It came from just two hands. The guests could not look away. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, as if pulled closer by an invisible thread. Others closed their eyes, letting the music paint pictures in their minds. It no longer mattered who they were outside this room. In that moment, they were listeners, travelers carried by a story told. Without words, the server's heart raced, but not from fear. It was the rush of release, of finally giving everything he had kept locked inside. Each note was like a confession, each chord like a breath he had held for too long. The music carried his past, the loneliness, the struggles, the long nights of doubt. But it also carried his hope, the belief that beauty can be born in the quietest places. And as the hall absorbed his truth, he realized he was no longer invisible. At one table, a man known for never showing emotion sat with wet eyes. He reached for his glass of wine to distract himself, but his hand shook too much to lift it. At another, a woman who had spent the evening scrolling through her phone now clutched her chest, her diamond necklace catching the light as her breathing slowed. Even the servers standing at the back, his co-workers who had never guessed his secret, stared in awe. Some whispered to each other, unable to believe the same man who polished glasses beside them was the one commanding the entire room. The music grew faster, his hands a blur across the keys. The sound filled every corner of the hall, wrapping the glittering crowd in something far richer than wealth. It was raw humanity, and though none of them knew his personal story, they felt it, the weight, the longing, the resilience. The honesty of it connected them in ways money never could. The server closed his eyes again, and in his mind he was back in his small apartment. The peeling paint, the broken window, the old keyboard with missing keys, but now it was transformed in his imagination. That small space had become endless, the music bursting beyond its walls, and here he was, proving to himself that the dream had never been foolish. It had been waiting, growing, ready for this very night. Every detail of the restaurant faded. The chandeliers, the golden cutlery, the endless glasses of wine, none of it mattered anymore. The only thing real was the sound of the piano and the way it connected everyone present. The music lifted him above his life of shadows, above the uniform he wore, above the silence he had endured. And in that lift, the crowd came with him. The melody softened again, dipping low like a whispered secret. The audience leaned in, not wanting to miss a single sound. He played gently, almost tenderly, as though speaking directly to each person in the room. It felt personal, intimate, like he had reached into their hearts and placed a piece of his own there. And then, just as quietly, the music began to rise once more. It grew stronger, fuller, climbing higher until it became something larger than the room itself. The guests sat spellbound, no longer thinking about their businesses, their vacations, or their wealth. They were reminded of something deeper, something simple, that life, at its core, is made of moments like this, moments of truth, connection, and beauty. It was a truth they hadn't expected to find in a restaurant on a Friday night, and yet here it was, delivered not by a famous performer, but by a man they had overlooked countless times. The server's chest rose and fell with each phrase. Sweat glistened at his brow, but he did not falter. He was no longer playing the piano. He was living through it. It carried his pain, his hope, his fight, and gave it back as something beautiful. The music had taken over, and he had surrendered completely. And in surrender, he found power as the piece reached its peak. The hall itself seemed to shake with sound. The chandeliers shimmered, the tables vibrated faintly, and the very air felt alive. No one moved, no one dared interrupt. The music crashed like a storm, then softened like rain, carrying everyone along its path, and when it finally began to fade, easing into a gentle close, the room remained breathless. The last note lingered, trembling in the silence. The server lifted his hands slowly, his fingers hovering in the air, as though reluctant to let go. For a moment, he kept his eyes closed, afraid that if he looked up, the spell would break. But when he finally opened them, he saw the truth written across every face in the hall. They were no longer looking at him as a server, they were looking at him as an artist. And in that gaze, he felt something he had waited his whole life to feel: recognition. The crowd transformed. The final notes still floated in the air when the hall sank into a silence deeper than before. It was not the awkward silence of confusion, nor the empty silence of indifference. It was the silence that follows truth. The kind of silence where people feel too much to speak. The server sat frozen at the piano, his chest rising and falling, unsure if he had just created magic or made a mistake too big to fix. But then he lifted his head, and what he saw stunned him. The glittering crowd that had once laughed, whispered, and clinked their glasses now stared at him with faces softened, eyes wide, hearts open. For the first time, they truly saw him, not as a server, not as a man in a uniform blending into the background, but as someone who had given them something they hadn't known they needed. In the front row, a woman dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her napkin. Her necklace sparkled under the lights, but in that moment she looked stripped of all wealth, human and vulnerable. At another table, a man who had spent the evening boasting about his company's profits now sat slumped forward, his hand covered, his mouth as if the music had pulled down a wall he didn't know he carried. Even the younger guests, who had checked their phones throughout dinner, sat with their screens face down, their attention fixed on the piano. The server had not just played notes. He had shifted something inside them. The sound had peeled away the layers of pride and performance they wore like armor. In its place was something simpler, something more honest. For once, wealth, status, and titles meant nothing. They were simply people listening, feeling, remembering. One man whispered softly to his wife, his voice barely audible in the quiet, "Do you hear it? It feels like he's playing my own memories." She nodded, her hand clutching his, her face wet with tears, and though the server couldn't hear their words, he saw their expressions. He knew the music had reached them. The event manager, standing at the side of the stage, had her hand pressed against her chest. She had doubted him, almost refused him, yet now she couldn't believe what she was witnessing. This was not the filler she had feared. This was not second best. This was the moment that would define the evening. She looked at the crowd and realized that he had given her more than entertainment. He had given her a memory no one there would forget. The transformation spread through the hall like ripples in water. Where there had been chatter, there was quiet. Where there had been shallow smiles, there was depth. And where there had been distance, there was connection. It didn't matter that they came from wealth and he came from shadows. At this moment, they were united by the invisible thread of his music. The server felt it too. At first, he had played for survival, to prove he belonged. But now, seeing their faces, he understood that something bigger had happened. He hadn't just given them music. He had reminded them of their humanity. He had shown them that beauty doesn't wear a price tag. That truth can come from anyone, anywhere. And in that realization, he felt lighter than he ever had before. Some guests began to clap quietly, hesitant at first, as though afraid to break the magic. Then others joined, the sound growing stronger, fuller, until the hall echoed with applause. It wasn't the polite applause they usually gave after a performance. This was something deeper, something grateful. The kind of applause that said, "You moved me, you reached me, you changed something in me." The server lowered his head slightly, almost overwhelmed. He had never imagined such a reaction. never dreamed that people who had ignored him minutes earlier would now applaud him with tears in their eyes. And yet here it was, undeniable. The applause thundered, but underneath it, he sensed the silence that lingered still. The silence of hearts changed. One older woman stood to her feet, clapping firmly. Her gesture sparked others, and soon the room rose in a standing ovation, diamonds, and silk, suits, and ties. All standing for the man they had once dismissed. The sight nearly broke him. Not from pride, but from disbelief. How quickly the world could change, how a life lived in shadows could, in one moment, step into light. But perhaps the most powerful transformation was not in the guests themselves. It was in the way they looked at him now. There was no trace of mockery, no trace of dismissal. They looked at him with respect, with admiration, with a recognition he had craved without even knowing it. In their eyes, he was not a server, not an employee, but an artist who had given them a gift. The server's hands still rested lightly on the piano, his body trembling with the aftermath of pouring everything into the music. And though he felt exhausted, he also felt alive. He had always believed music mattered, even if no one heard it. Now he knew for certain it mattered because it could reach people in ways nothing else could, and tonight it had reached the unreachable. The glittering crowd had been silenced, then transformed. They would leave the restaurant later still, dressed in wealth, still carrying their titles, still living their comfortable lives. But they would never forget the night a server played the piano and reminded them that underneath it all, they were simply human. And as the applause washed over him, he understood something he would carry forever. He had not just played for them, he had played with them, together. In that golden hall, they had shared something rare and unspoken. And that was more valuable than all the jewels and champagne in the world. A standing ovation, the sound of applause, thundered through the hall. It rolled like a wave, rising higher with every clap, until the walls themselves seemed to tremble. The server sat frozen at the piano bench, his chest rising and falling, his hands trembling from more than just the music he had played for so long. He had lived in silence, unseen, unheard. Yet in this moment the silence had broken, replaced by something he had never dared to imagine. The glittering crowd stood on their feet, row after row, their voices blending with cheers and whistles. It was not the polite applause of wealthy guests checking a box. It was real, raw, overflowing. Their faces glowed with emotion, stripped of their practiced smiles and polished pride. They were no longer looking at a server in uniform. They were looking at an artist who had touched their hearts. The sound pressed against him, almost overwhelming. His throat tightened as he bowed his head, unsure how to receive so much love at once. He had dreamed of this moment quietly in his small apartment, playing alone into the night, but to see it now, with hundreds of eyes on him, felt surreal, almost like stepping into a dream he didn't believe he deserved. A woman in the front row lifted her hands above her head, clapping with all her strength, tears running freely down her face. Beside her, a man who had earlier bragged about his success now shouted encore, his voice breaking with emotion. Even the younger guests, who had arrived with restless energy, stamped their feet, whistled, and cheered. The transformation was complete. The crowd was no longer a glittering wall of indifference. They were sea of humanity, united in awe. The event manager stood at the side of the stage, her eyes wide, her hand pressed against her mouth. She had worried he would embarrass them, that he would stumble. But now she knew she had witnessed something unforgettable. Her headset buzzed with unanswered questions, but she ignored it. Unable to look away from the man at the piano, he had not only saved the evening, he had elevated it beyond anything she could have planned. The server finally rose from the bench, his legs unsteady. He bowed slightly, and the applause roared louder, filling his chest with warmth. He had spent years bowing in silence while clearing plates and serving wine, unseen, unnoticed. But this bow was different. This one was returned. Not with dismissal, but with recognition. The other servers at the back clapped too, their trays still in their hands, their smiles wide with pride. They whispered to each other, unable to believe the quiet man they worked with every night had carried such a gift all along. Some wiped their eyes discreetly. Others laughed in disbelief. For them, too, the evening had transformed. They would never look at him the same way again. The applause stretched on, refusing to die. Every time it began to soften, someone shouted, someone clapped harder, someone cheered, and the wave rose again. It was as if the crowd was desperate to give back something of what he had given them. They had been moved, humbled, reminded of their own humanity, and now they wanted him to know it, to feel it, to believe it. The server's chest swelled with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. For years, his music had been locked in the shadows of a small apartment, heard only by peeling walls and broken windows. But tonight, it had filled a golden hall and touched the hearts of people who had once ignored him. And in that standing ovation, he understood something. He was no longer invisible. The chandeliers sparkled above, the candles flickered at the tables. But no one noticed the luxury anymore. The only treasure that mattered was the feeling they shared in that moment. The wealthy crowd, the staff, the musicians who hadn't arrived, none of it mattered. What mattered was the truth that had been revealed, that beauty can come from the most unexpected places, and greatness can rise from the shadows. Finally, as the applause began to soften, the server bowed once more, his eyes shimmering. He whispered, "A quiet thank you," though his voice was lost in the noise. But perhaps words were not needed. The music had already said everything. As he stepped away from the piano, the hall remained alive with energy. Guests leaned toward one another, speaking in hushed tones, eager to capture what they had just experienced. They knew they would remember this night, not for the wine, not for the food, not for the wealth on display, but for the moment a man who had been invisible became unforgettable. And though the server returned to the shadows at the edge of the stage, something in him had changed forever. He had given his heart to the music, and, in return, the world had given him recognition. It was more than applause, more than praise. It was proof that he mattered. That his voice, though hidden for so long, had finally been heard. The standing ovation was not just for the notes he played. It was for the courage it took to play them, for the years of unseen practice, for the resilience of dreaming without encouragement, for the honesty of sharing himself with strangers who had never looked at him before. And as the last claps echoed into silence, the young server knew his life would never be the same again. He had stepped into the light, and the world had welcomed him there.